Welcome to InnerView, a podcast for recruiters who are interested in thoughtful and practical discussions on issues, strategies, and disruptive technologies that are essentially impacting the staffing and recruitment industry. And our three experts are going to be first, John Jeltema, who is our recruitment guru. He has over 20 years of experience representing high-level job seekers in their job search and negotiations. And John's going to bring the candidates and interviewees' perspective to the entire discussion. Our second expert is Mark Bassett, and he's going to be our executive search guru. He has over 25 years of experience hiring employees and contractors at, all different various levels of companies, ranging from startups to even Fortune 100 companies. And Mark is going to represent the clients in the hiring process, and he brings the employer's perspective to this discussion. And finally, our last expert is Debarshi Chadjuri, our technology guru with extensive experience building, reviewing, implementing recruitment tech, and even hiring hundreds of people to do it. Debarshi brings the tech employer's perspective to this discussion, and we'll also have invited guests contributing on their own specific topics of expertise in the future. So just go ahead and subscribe to the feed, and you'll be able to stay abreast of any upcoming topics and guests that we have on the show. So in this particular episode, we're going to be covering the preparation of the candidates and hiring managers for interviews. And this is essentially the recruiter's job, from the point where the candidate has been vetted and an interview with the hiring manager has been already set. So as a recruiter, how do you prep the candidate and the client for the interview? Before we get into the episode, we're just going to quickly talk about our sponsors for this episode, Applicant. And it's an automated video interviewing platform, and you could just go ahead and go to applicant.com to check out more information. And the spelling is a bit different. It's APPLIQANT.com. Just go to their website for more information. So with that being said, let's get into the show. So let's get right into some questions, guys. I think we could start with the approach to the interview. So what should be the approach to the interview for the candidate and the interviewer? And how do you organize the interview? So we'll break it down to two parts. I think maybe we should kick it off with John. Maybe you want to start off with your input?
Absolutely. So, essentially approaching to the interview, candidates should go in with the idea that they've got a plan towards the interview on how to structure it, what they've done in advance to prepare for it, including questions and research about the organization and being able to answer questions that the hiring manager asks about their knowledge of the organization. Ultimately, when they get into the interview, they should be structuring their interview from a gather, give, get perspective, where they're gathering information from the hiring manager or the interviewer initially, giving information about themselves, and then getting to the next step, essentially closing down the interview and getting closure to the next step of the process.
I'd like to hear more from an employer's perspective also. So Mark, maybe you want to also drop some of your insight on there?
Sure. Yeah, prepping the employer is a little tricky because they're going to have, obviously, their own agenda, and they're going to have their own plan for interviewing. For me, it's an opportunity. It's probably the first real opportunity to gain trust and to gain a consultative relationship with that client, because as everybody knows, if we're working either for a contingency fee or a contract hire or even on a retainer, we've got a stake in this as recruiters, and so we want the hire to be made. And I think we're automatically suspect when we prep the client. So in order to kind of take down that wall, the first and most important thing I do, rather than try and direct how they're going to interview, is to try and present my candidate fairly. Now, we've already got him scheduled. They've agreed to see him, but I want to make sure that, for instance, I'm not hiding any red flags. I want to go as far as pointing them out and say, here's the three people you're going to be seeing. I've got concerns about candidate A in this area and in that area. You may want to probe that a little bit. Here's another area where it might be an obstacle based on, him being not quite as experienced as you're seeking. In other words, they're going to find this out anyway. There's nothing we can do that's, gonna perfect the candidate, based on the background that they're bringing to the table. So I'd rather kind of collaborate with that client and say, here's all the things you want to cover. Here's the obstacles that you may want to address and some red flags that you can look at. And now all of a sudden, he's hopefully more attentive and realizes that I'm not just pushing my guy. The second area that I like to distinguish between is the difference between a candidate who maybe applied for the position, which they're very used to, and a difference between a candidate that might have been recruited for the position. That latter, being a passive resource, is not somebody who has a resume active and he's not actively job seeking. So I might want to differentiate that for the client to be able to say, look, this person needs to be approached differently. We've gone after him directly for this position. He's interested at a high level, but at this point he's just kicking tires. So let's make sure we're selling them. If I can get the client on a sales posture, trying to get the candidate excited about why he should interview there, that's a win for me. That's going to change the whole playing field and level it out quite a bit.
Okay, let's jump into a more of an tech employer's perspective. Debarshi, can you also give some insight on that question?
Sure. So actually, from my perspective, I'm kind of expecting the candidates to come prepared to some extent, both on the job and on the company. So I almost take it upon myself to keep them a little bit on their toes. So I'm sort of trying to bring perspectives into the interview where the preparation doesn't come through. So basically coming up with scenarios in the interview that obviously the recruiters would not have known about, and talking about that. And most of my interviews, at least, are very freewheeling in nature, in the sense that I will start off on a topic and then basically lead off of that with the candidate and basically dig deeper into anything that they bring up as part of their conversations. So really, I'm trying to move away from the prepared speeches and the prepared answers that they might have. But that's not to say that the structure of the interview can really changes. It is just that I want them to be more real than a prepared candidate would be. So I guess, but I would also obviously want them to show enough interest in the job to prepare themselves and know enough about the job and the company to show me that they will be interested in actually joining if I decide to hire them.
So, Debarshi, that's a good point. My perspective when it comes to the candidate preparation is really to get them in the mindset of interviewing, have them have additional comfort by going in with a plan and being prepared for the interview. But ultimately, they do need to go with the flow with the direction of where the hiring manager wants to go with the interview. If they can guide the hiring manager through a gather, give, get approach, great. But if that is detrimental to their success in the interview, then again, got to go with the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, the candidates that I really like, that I almost always end up hiring, are the people who can teach me something in the interview. That's really the best kind of interview that I ever have, where the interview starts off with a leading question, and then it becomes a discussion between me and the candidate, and as part of which hopefully the candidate learns something, and hopefully I learn something from them about the stuff that they have done that I might not have experienced before. That really tells me that they have experience, they have sufficient experience in the field, they actually can think through problems, and then even when I bring them on board, they will add more than just following directions, right? I mean, that's really what I need from the best candidates, where they can add value to the company and to my knowledge base.
Debarshi, you said something about taking the candidate off the prep track. Like, in other words, he's come prepared to say X, Y, and Z, and you want to kind of get to the real person, is what I'm reading between the lines. I've had clients tell me, and this is, I know we're speaking mostly to recruiters today, that they can actually often identify what agency the candidate has come from based on the way the person's been prepped. In other words, we need to be really careful about giving them specific questions to ask or certain taglines, because in many clients' experience, it's like, okay, every time I bring somebody in from XYZ resource, they ask questions like, how can I best be prepared for the job, and what's been my experience with X, Y, and Z, and like scripted questions. So I've listened to John prep enough candidates that he doesn't do that. Like, he lets the candidates think for themselves. He may sketch a high level idea and say, you'll want to get to this information or that information, but he doesn't give them the words. And that's a huge red flag, because I think if a client thinks, okay, everybody's being prepped for this position in this way, then yeah, you're never going to get to the real candidate.
Yeah, and I think from that perspective, what I would advise a recruiter to do when they're prepping a candidate is really to say, ask them to focus on a couple of core areas that they're very, very comfortable in, right? It's like, basically try to take the interview itself in a direction where you are talking about something that you are very comfortable with and you have a lot of experience with. And then it becomes a playing field where they are sort of the number one, and the interviewer is really at a disadvantage because the candidate knows more than the interviewer about that specific topic. Mm-hmm. And it might be related to the job. It obviously should be related to the job, but it will be enough of a niche where the candidate knows more about it than the interviewer. And if the candidate can find that niche in the interview, which is of interest to the interviewer, and they don't know enough about it, that's really, I think, the sweet spot here.
Yeah, it's actually coming across as if there's like this fine line you have to find as far as preparation. I'm feeling that you can over prepare for the interview. So I'm assuming you can. Maybe how little, how much? How do you find that sweet spot?
I think that's part of what's key for the recruiter who's prepping the candidate. They need to understand and know the client. Ideally, if they haven't had history with the client, they ask the questions up front with the hiring manager, the interview process, and what's likely to be discussed, what the candidate needs to be prepared for, anything specific that may be required for that particular role in that particular conversation. So the more the recruiter can gather from the hiring manager up front, the more effective they can be in helping prepare the candidate. And realizing, of course, that the hiring manager is only going to give them the information that they're okay with the recruiter prepping the candidate with. So it very much depends on the situation. So yes, there's over preparation and under preparation. It's part of the recruiting specialist to determine that fine line of what's appropriate for that particular circumstance. So my goal is to have all the information I can going into it, along with a process and a methodology that I can relay, and I can tweak that presentation, that preparation, I should say, with the candidates, based on the need.
I think what John said about understanding the client is key. It's not just understanding the job description, right? But even at individual contributor levels, but certainly at management and executive levels, these people need to at least have a basis of understanding of what the company does, how they differentiate what they do, what's their position in the marketplace, beyond just the job. And I think if they are prepared to ask intelligent questions like that, most of my clients will say, look, they don't have to get it right. I just want to see that they attempted to do it. But if somebody just comes in completely unprepared or only prepared for technical questions for a Java developer, for instance, without really understanding, what are we building and what are we working on, and how would I be a part of that, and how the company overall involved in that, and how do they differentiate? Yeah, that person's going to take is going to be considered much more collaborative and better prepared, and professionally curious. It's not just a project. I'm going to go spend 8 to 10 hours a day of my life. Half of my waking life will be spent here. That you would hope that person would want to examine that as thoroughly as they would, a potential spouse or partner.
Right. And from what I see is if I think this goes back to what Mark said earlier about being almost able to identify this recruitment agency that a candidate is coming from based on their answers or their questions. That would really turn me off in an interview if I feel that, hey, this person's just regurgitating whatever the recruiter told them. and they're coming up, and I have a series of people who are coming to me with sort of the same comments or the questions. That's over preparation in my mind. It should never be spoon fed to the candidate, because that just tells me that the person's not really ready to think for themselves. So really, they should come across as natural. The questions they ask should come across as natural, something that they actually are interested in, rather than something that was told to them that they should be interested in.
I completely understand that, but I do find that over the years that I've been preparing candidates for interviews, I may do the same prep, even though it's evolved over the 23 years I've done this. I can do the same prep with two different people, and they have two very different results. It's very few people that I find that go in and say the same thing the same way to the same hiring manager. But I get that. It doesn't keep me from prepping them the same way, but at least for the same job. But it does, there's definitely differences in their takeaway from my preparation conversation with them than between the individuals. So they're not gonna approach it the same way. And if they do, you're right. They're a robot. They're a machine. They're not, they're not going to be right for the job. They don't think for themselves. This is one reason why I tend to do my preparation verbally rather than via, a document that I've been asked by candidates to send a document to them for the preparation, because for whatever reason, they don't want to talk to me about it. Well, my fear there is exactly, what you're saying. Maybe they memorize the things that I've got in there and, duplicate it. But when I have a live conversation with them, I ask them to write things down, but they write different things down, or they type it out on their computer and they use it in a different way. So it's rare that I find that the conversations are duplicative, robotic. But I do find that certain hiring managers expect me, and they partly because they've been on the candidate side for where I've represented them for other organizations they were trying to interview for, but they expect me to prep, and if I don't, I've been lectured. So I'm religious about the prep. That being said, they expect me to prep and do my work and earn my fee. But if the candidate comes across that robotic, they're going to pass on them, and I realize that too. But I rarely find candidates sounding like other candidates for a given job.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is also it's gonna help if we could differentiate the difference between the active and the passive job seeker. So I like to kind of jump into a little bit of that. That way it'll help out. Maybe also we could jump into preparing the hiring manager. How do you prepare the hiring manager that the recruit must be sold on the role?
Well, I get involved in that part of the process long before we've even gotten to the interview stage, because if I'm not going to have, if my client is not going to be responsive to a passive candidate, if he's not going to be willing to go the extra mile and kind of encourage him or sell him, if you will, on the opportunity, then my efforts recruiting are going to be wasted. So for instance, if I've got a person who's not worked with agencies before, and he's been relying on an HR department whose best efforts have been simply just posting a job description and dealing with the applicants who apply, then I need to go into a whole conversation and probably personalize it. Mr. Hiring Manager, for instance, you're in this position over here at XYZ company. You're reasonably happy in the job, but you hear from me about an opportunity at another organization, and you tell me, hey, I'm not really looking, but that sounds interesting. This is a person who probably hasn't even put a resume together. The advantage with that kind of candidate is, this has long been established for me, that person will make a decision based on the strength of the opportunity, and that's it. In other words, he's not going to have 5 or 6 other interviews to compete with. And in a good market like we're in, as everybody knows who's been active in it, you take a candidate off one of the resume boards, or Dice or Career Builders or Monster or wherever you get the person. By the time you've got him out on an interview, he's probably got 4 or 5 other interviews. He's probably not going to prepare as thoroughly for it, and he's probably not putting as much effort into even deciding whether to take the interview. So my passive candidate is probably more likely to be better prepare himself, and certainly more likely to research the company to see if it's even worth his time. But the hiring manager needs to be aware that, hey, this is a guy who, if he's got a resume, he put it together for you, right? So this is not, I need a paycheck, I need a job, I'm on the market. This is, hey, I'm happy in my job, but if this opportunity affords the next step in my career, then I'm willing to explore that. So what my client needs to be aware of is, what is that next step? What are his goals? And if he's not willing to speak to that, and many of them aren't, many of them don't feel that's worth it. They'll say, well, why would you send me somebody who's not looking? And if that's the person's mindset, okay, at least I know that, and I'll only send active seekers. But that's not going to be, that will rarely go well if he's not prepared to go that extra mile.
So to me, there's two elements that go here, go along with the preparation of the hiring manager. The first one is, the position itself. The reason why it's open, why does somebody want this role? Why does somebody want to work for you and your organization? And then to lay the expectations with them, so we can use that information essentially to go woo the candidates. But we also need from them, to set the expectations with them about what types of candidates are likely going to be wooed, right? Wooable, if you will. And so the preparation really starts from the very beginning of getting the job, and knowing that they're looking for the passive seeker that's coming from a direct competitor or elsewhere. Understanding the elements of their organization, experienced recruiter is going to know what the market's like, know what kind of elements are key to wooing the right candidates, and we lay out those expectations clearly to the hiring manager so that preparation is done, conversation one about the job. And then the second part is really about the candidates, understanding the candidates. What makes them wooable? What are the key things? Maybe it's a job opportunity, maybe it's step up, maybe it's compensation, God forbid, solely anyhow. Maybe it's location, maybe it's the industry and the product. It could be all kinds of stuff. But we need to know specifically, having had enough thorough vetting qualification conversation with the candidate, we need to know specifically so that we can help the client, the hiring manager, to effectively woo them collectively with our efforts. So we can woo them, but that hiring manager needs to understand what's important to that particular, candidate as well. And so we can only go by what candidates share with us, but we got to be able to ask the right questions to gather that information and help use that information to help prepare our hiring managers for those first, second, and third interviews, all the way through to making the offer and onboarding the candidate. So it really covers both sides there.
Yeah. And from my perspective, again, somebody who's not looking but is not actively looking, not desperate for a job, but shows up for an interview anyway, is sometimes the best kind of candidate, because I know they've come here and they've decided to spend their time on an interview because they're actually interested in the job or in the company. So it becomes a very, a different kind of interview at that point. As we're talking about just me selling them on the job or the company. Part of it is, in many cases, and this defining the role itself to something that would make it more enticing for them. So again, the theory, the situation here is they have a job, they have a role, they have a position. They're looking for something better. We're obviously we all try to stay away from people who are just trying to move for the money. So hopefully it's a bigger goal than that. In most cases, it's really the role that defines it. And in many cases, it actually helps me to define the role with the person. So because my companies are not huge 5,000 people companies. We have a lot more flexibility in how we can define the roles. So I can work with the candidates and basically figure out a niche for them or a role for them that they feel is a significant step up in terms of their responsibilities or their position, and that's something that helps me and helps them as we move forward, and so I think that's something from a preparation perspective is something that an inactive candidate can be told about, is basically to think about how they would structure it. So if I ask them the question, okay, what kind of role would make you come work for me? At that point, they should have a fairly clear picture in their mind as to what they would like to be doing 3 months into the future or 6 months into the future, and how they would want to evolve that role going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point, and you've got to get to that in the recruiting call or in your interview with the candidate. What you don't want to run into is the obstacle where he's agreed to go on the interview, and when you start talking about why he's looking, he comes back. He goes, "Well, what do you mean why I'm looking? You called me." It's like, okay, yeah, but you're obviously taking this interview, right? So what's missing in your current situation, or what do you lack in terms of a next step that you'd like to see in the next one? Those are the kind of hot buttons I can share with a client who can kind of frame his organization and his team and the mission and the product and the role itself in the manner that would get that passive job seeker interested in the opportunity.
And sometimes, actually, Mark, sometimes it's going to be money. That could be the hot topic. So I want to jump into money for a second. And I know we're going to have a full conversation at some point, but let's start off with you. Give us a couple 1-2 punches on how you're going to instruct both parties to have that money conversation.
Yeah, so if we're doing our jobs right, then my instruction to both parties is that that's not even a topic for conversation in the first interview. And all along here, we have not really designated whether, by the way, this was a phone interview or an in-person interview. And the phone interviews are becoming more and more common. I would say, 4 out of 5 are the first step is a phone interview. Absolutely inappropriate on the phone interview. If the topic comes up, I've always instructed both parties to say that it's been covered. Like, Mark's aware of what I'm making. I know he shared that with you, and he assures me that I'm well within the range. Or from the client side, to bring that up, I would ask the candidate not to pin himself down to a specific number. The most common thing I hear, and if anybody's listening that's been a recruiter for any period of time, you've heard this too, and you've actually heard these words, is, on a disaster follow-up call, when the candidate admits to having brought up money and he says, well, he brought it up, so he asked me what I was looking for, and I said 142,000, and here's the key words, and he didn't bat an eye. Now, we happen to know that he's making 120,000. We've presented him on a job that pays 125 to 130, and I say the reason the employer did not bat an eye is because he's got no intention of paying 142, and that's probably the end of your interview. So I would rather. If we're doing our job right as agents, then that conversation should be directed to us individually. I don't mind. And there's another, this gets really personal when you're talking about money, right? In fact, there's a new law in California. I can't even ask a candidate what his current salary is. If he doesn't volunteer that, I don't get to know. So it's a deeply personal subject. And it can be offending too, right? So if the company is going to make a lower offer, or discuss a lower number, I would rather be the one that brings that information to the candidate and let him be upset with me as opposed to being upset with the potential employer, and vice versa. If I'm talking to the client on behalf of the candidate and I'm trying to get, a 20% increase in his salary, I'd rather ask for that myself on his behalf, let the employer, blow a gasket and just say, well, okay, I'm just trying to push the envelope here to see what kind of room we've got. That wasn't the candidate having that conversation. So I don't know if you guys feel differently, but for me, I try and keep all of that in my bucket individually with both. And then you've got to overcome, this is a whole topic for another conversation for other podcasts. But then you've got to overcome the recruiter cushion, which is what employers tend to call it. In other words, when I tell my employer that my candidate is seeking 120 and that's the lowest he'll accept, the employer almost always automatically assumes that I've cushioned that by, say, 10%, feeling that, okay, that means I can offer him 108 and he'll be able to, and he'll be willing to accept the job. And then, if we're miraculously able to close that, we don't look like heroes for closing a lowball offer. We look like liars because, look, he took 108 after all. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. And I'd really rather try and handle that directly with each party, at least until the final interview. You guys feel differently about that?
I think really, and again, we've got to, based on the type of interview it is, right? First, second, over the phone, in person, whatever it is. Assuming this is a first round interview, or at least not a last round interview. My point is always the same. The focus is, do we want to work together? And that's the way the candidate, the interviewee, needs to go in, and the interviewee needs to go into those interviews. Do we want to work together? So look at the quality of the job, the quality of the person, their capabilities. Look at all the elements that are going to be important to why do you want to get out of bed in the morning and go to work there Monday through Friday, 40 plus hours a week. If that's not even there, who cares about the compensation? It doesn't matter. So that being said, there's certain managers, HR oftentimes too, will, that's part of their checklist. They got to ask, what compensation do you need? Well, in my perspective, and the advice I give to candidates, and it does depend on the situation. So there are some exceptions, again, for another podcast. But my suggestions is, hiring manager or HR manager, I'm glad you're asking. It sounds like you're interested in background for the organization. I'm excited to hear that because I'm excited about you guys as well. But quite frankly, I went into this conversation today with the expectation that we would discuss, really focus on, do we want to work together? Do I have the skills you need? Do you have the role that can keep me engaged for the foreseeable future? And do we want to work together? But the fact you're asking is, to me, is a great sign, and I'm excited about it. But if you don't mind, what do you feel is appropriate for my skills in your environment? And so essentially, I suggest to candidates at least to avoid the conversation or the question. If they can't avoid it, that's another thing. If the hiring manager is persistent about it, then you got to do what you got to do. But if you can pass it off as an initial conversation that's exploring the possibility of working together, and even just say, hey, I'd love to sleep on it and get back to you. Would you mind if I do that? But any conversation about compensation is premature so early on in the interview.
Hey, Debarshi, I wonder, now that we have the luxury of having you on this call, would that kind of response offend you as a hiring manager, or would you roll with that?
Well, me personally, absolutely not, because I tend to avoid that conversation entirely as well. As you guys mentioned, my usual strategy is before I even ask somebody to come to the interview, I at least get an understanding of whether they're in the range of salary that we're looking for, right?
Right.
So if I have a range of 120 to 150,000, that's something I will vet with the recruiter first and say, okay, this is my range. Is this person in it? Or ballpark in it. Mm-hmm. And if the number is 300,000, I'm really never calling that person for an interview because it would be pointless. I don't have the budget for that. But once they're in, to John's point, I'm really at that point, the salary conversation is kind of out of the window. If I really like the person and would want to bring them on board, then as long as they're in that range, if they're on the top end of the range, that's fine because that's still within the range. And then I would just ask somebody else from the organization to drive the compensation discussion with the recruiter. That's really how I would approach it. So from a personal perspective, since I will never ask the salary question, the answer would not offend me. Having said that, there are people obviously who ask that question and in an interview, and that particular response, I think is fine. If a candidate says they're willing to get back to you with something, that's actually not a bad response for most things, because it tells you that they're actually actively considering it. They will put some thought into it. Yeah, you do expect at that point to hear back from them or the recruiter within 24 hours. If you haven't heard back in 24 hours, that's a bad sign. But as long as within 24 hours the recruiter gets back to you and says, okay, this is the number, that's fine. And that also puts the onus on the control back in the recruiter's court, in a sense, as the recruiter being the agent who can then negotiate the number with the employer.
And John mentioned the HR manager's perspective, and we didn't clarify that either, but the distinction between the hiring manager and the HR person, the biggest frustration to me is that, say, when that money conversation comes up with HR and the candidate does as instructed and answers that question with a question, now the HR person gives a range for the position, and they said, what's the salary range? And they'll say, well, it's 122 to 164. Now, here's a candidate who's been prepped for his 130 and he's going to accept 140, but he just heard that the job pays up to 162. And what's unrealistic and unfortunate is that human resources manager or talent acquisition leader answered a technical question, the range for the position. You might ask that same person, what's the hiring range, and get a much lower number. Like she's just answered to say, hey, while you're in this position over a period of the next 7 years, this could be reviewed and raised all the way up to 162,000. But, a hiring cap is 142. It gets to be super tricky. So there's one other adage I'll put in, and this is the last thing I'll mention on that topic. I heard a long time ago when it came to compensation that it's not what you make, it's what you keep. And there's a whole lot of difference between a high salary position that has no benefits, that has a long commute, that has a lot of expenses that are associated with it, versus another one that might have stock options and the value of those benefits and how much is your personal time worth on a commute. You can get a lot of wiggle room, as much as I think 20 and 25% on a salary range when you really review how much that person is spending to live his life in his current position and how much it might be different in this position.
All right, let's jump into our next segment, our recruiters' favorite tools, where we're just going to basically pick one tool, app, or just kind of like process that our recruitment team uses to make their work more efficient. And we're going to discuss some pros and cons of those tools and make some suggestions for how it can be improved. So what is our favorite tool for today, guys?
I'll jump into this one. So basically, we've just started using Microsoft Teams, and traditionally, it's been a more software development oriented tool, just like Slack. But what we've realized is it can be used very effectively as a collaborative tool for a recruitment team and any particular team, because it allows people to. It's more than a messaging platform. It's really a collaboration platform where you can create wikis, share files, and of course have personal chats and group chats as well. And it saves a history for all of the conversation that's going on in different channels, so that people can look it up at any given time to find relevant information about specific topics. It's also something that most people are not aware of, but if you have Microsoft Office 365 account, you most probably have a Teams account as part of it for free. As opposed to a Slack account where you're probably spending up to $12 a month per user additionally to your email account. So that's just something I wanted to bring up, is a tool that can give you the collaboration and the online ongoing sort of feedback and productivity that software teams enjoy. That can actually be utilized by recruitment teams.
Yeah, I'll follow on to that too. Devarshi's our technology specialist. I'm our untechnology specialist. I'm the guy who's all thumbs with new apps, and takes me a while to get it. And it's only been a few days since we installed Microsoft Teams and started using it. But I got to say, even for myself, it was very easy. I'm looking at the podcast topic and guest ideas spreadsheet that we've got here, and records of the conversations that we had up to this point, and the various questions and whatnot, and it's very easy to navigate. It was super simple to use. So if you're a technophobe, I wouldn't let that scare you off on Microsoft Teams.
And just to clarify for this podcast, this is not a marketing spiel for any tool really. So we just want to. Teams has its downsides as well. I'll be the first to admit it, and there's significant improvements that can be made, especially with some aspects of the user interface, and also some of the communication tools seem to actually work better with Skype, which is kind of strange because they're both owned by Microsoft. So yeah, this segment is not for us to shill for a product. Really, it's really just talking about something that we use that could potentially be improved, and may work for some companies and may not for others. So hopefully you can try it out on your own and make a decision for yourself.
All right, so now let's go with one, maybe everyone could run through one powerful key insight that'll kind of wrap up the whole preparation process. We could start with John. Maybe you want to give some sort of insight to wrap up the episode.
As a seasoned recruiter, I find that it's absolutely imperative that I prep both my hiring managers and candidates for the interviews. It significantly improves the effectiveness of the interview and the potential for success in filling the position, helping the hiring manager out, and helping the candidate get a new position.
Okay. Any other insights?
My key thing from a preparation standpoint, advice to recruiters would be, just to reiterate, that have the candidate focus on their strengths, right? And pick one or two key areas that they're the most comfortable in and try to lead the interview in that direction. Because everything that I'm looking for comes from a level of confidence that the candidate will have if they're talking about something that they're very, very comfortable with.
And I think for me, it would be going back to the whole concept of trying to build trust and a consultative relationship with the client, that here's your real opportunity to do so with, full disclosure. I think it's easier for us often to gain a trusted advisor relationship with a candidate who we're helping through a difficult process. But clients are very often awkward in their interviewing too. And so if we can guide them, if we can give them all the insight necessary on the candidate, and even help them along with how they interview if they're uncomfortable with that. This is a great opportunity to up your game and to be a trusted advisor as opposed to a vendor with a client.
All right. Well, thanks for listening in. If you have any comments or suggestions for the topics that you want us to discuss in the future, reach out to us via email at interview@inamics.com or on Twitter. So we'll be back soon with more content and suggestions about how to make your staffing operations simpler and more efficient.